Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for September 8th, 2022. Today I'm going to call your attention to two events which took place yesterday, both of which will hopefully be shaping a better future for all nations on Earth. The first was a press conference sponsored by the Executive Intelligence Review on shutting down NATO's Ukrainian kill list. The second event was Putin's speech in Vladivostok to the Eastern Economic Forum. These two events, which both occurred yesterday, are part of the emergence of a new majority in the world committed to a new security and financial architecture, which benefits all sovereign nations, not just the wealthy few. And by wealthy few, I don't mean wealthy few nations, but the wealthy few who control the so-called advanced sector nations. So let's begin with the Executive Intelligence Review press conference. This provided a full picture of the hideous truth of what's going on in Ukraine right now and the reality behind NATO's war against Russia. People who are in opposition to this war are being described as information terrorists who are put on a list that is a kill list, according to Western security experts. And all you have to do is look at what happened just over 2 weeks ago to Daria Dugina, a Russian journalist and activist who was on the list, who was blown up in a car bombing conducted most likely by Ukrainian-directed terrorists who killed her outside of Moscow. Now, many of the speakers who were at this event were on the Committee to Combat Disinformation blacklist, which is put out by the Ukrainian Defense Department, and also on the Mirotvorets kill list, as was Dugina. Some of these speakers included Colonel Richard Black, who's spoken often against the U.S. policy in Syria, and now he's been recently warning of the danger of nuclear war coming from the Western involvement in Ukraine. Former Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter, a passionate advocate of ending the Western support for the slaughter that's going on in Ukraine. Ray McGovern, the U.S. Senate candidate for New York, Diane Sayre, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, all of them are on the hit list. And for full disclosure, I should tell you I'm on the hit list of both the Committee to Combat Disinformation and Mirotvorets. What is my crime that labels me as an information terrorist? That I said that NATO's policy of arming the Ukrainians and urging them not to negotiate is responsible for the deaths of Ukrainians in large numbers by the continuation of the war. That makes me a Putin spokesman and an information terrorist, according to them. There were also speakers at this event from Denmark, from Serbia, Italy, Argentina, and elsewhere. It's a long video, but I would urge you to take the time to watch it because you'll learn things from this that you'll never get in the Western media. Now, including why are people placed on the list? That the calls for diplomatic negotiations to end the war makes you a Moscow puppet. The call to end the weapons deliveries makes you a Moscow puppet. The truth about neo-Nazis in Ukraine, because these lists are largely the effort of those people from the Organization for Ukrainian Nationalism and their offshoots, such as the Azov Battalion. They are the neo-Nazis who make up these organizations, creating this list, and presumably will be the ones who try to carry out the list. And also a challenge to the official lying narrative of why there's fighting going on in Ukraine. If you question that, if you ask why did the West not talk to Putin seriously, you're considered an apologist for Russian genocide. Now, also what was discussed was the role of U.S. NATO support for this targeting operation, including the most recent example of that, the September 1st and 2nd conference, in Kiev, which was attended by 24 nations, mostly NATO members in the US, and US officials who were there and spoke in support of their operations. In other words, targeting Americans for possible assassination, with American officials in the audience who didn't raise a peep to object to this. Also, a discussion of the funding of the counter-disinformation operations that is funding to silence Americans and put a chill on their free speech. You'll also see examples of courage, people who are speaking out despite threats to their life, speaking out and telling the truth. And finally, the call for the Congress to cut off the funding for this and for NATO countries to stop supporting such terrorist operations supposedly in the defense of Ukrainian freedom and sovereignty. So again, I urge you to watch this, to think about it, and to spread it around so other people can see it, because it's not being reported to you in the West, where we have a cone of silence placed over the opposition to this war policy. Now, the second event was the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok, which is a much more optimistic and forward-looking event. I'm going to just quote a little bit from Putin's keynote, because again, this is not being reported generally. But the fact is that, as was pointed out by the moderator of this event, the people speaking at this event represent more than half of the world's population, and that these are nations which refused to go along with the sanctions policy against Russia. In fact, they were appearing with Putin at the podium, including India, Vietnam, and other countries that are being targeted by the West to support the global NATO policy, as opposed to defending international law. Now, in his keynote, Putin was optimistic despite the Western efforts to destroy Russia, to wreck the economy, and to promote regime change. He charged Western nations with the effort to, quote, make everyone follow their rules, which benefit only the few. And by that, he was directly attacking this idea of a rules-based order. And he said what they're actually doing is extinguishing sovereignty to force submission, that nations will bend the rules which will benefit only those who make the rules. That is, they'll give in to the demands to give up their sovereignty. But Putin pointed out that there's a waning of U.S. dominance. He said, quote, the entire system of international relations has recently undergone irreversible tectonic shifts, adding that, quote, the Asian Pacific nations have emerged as new centers of economic and technological growth. He pointed out that the euro and the dollar and the pound are no longer trusted as suitable currencies for trade transactions, as they are subject to seizure by Western banks if you go against the Western narrative, and that you're subject to sanctions if you don't go along with the sanctions policy. So if you don't support sanctions against Russia, you might find yourself sanctioned. You might have your accounts shut down, your foreign reserves stolen. That's supposed to build trust in the Western system of democracy. And then what Putin outlined in contrast to that is optimistic plans for new transport corridors and connectivity, development of infrastructure, railways, seaports, pipelines. And he contrasted this growth perspective with the policies in the West, which include sanctions, which include flawed economic plans that have led to inflation, and the green policies, which are threatening adequate energy supplies to the Western nations, typified by Western leaders who say, we don't care if our people suffer with high prices and can't afford heat and food this winter. We will continue the policy of degrading Russia through support for the Ukrainian neo-Nazis, and that's final. So Putin pointed out, how is this democracy? Now, the question that's posed by all of this is, what is the West fighting for in Ukraine? To weaken or defeat Russia, toward what end? because Russia is such a bad actor in international policies, the Russians were patiently waiting for 8 years for the West to speak up against the shelling into the Donbas region, which killed 14,000 mostly civilians. They were waiting patiently for the Ukrainian government to follow up its commitment to the Minsk Accords to give limited autonomy to the eastern provinces of Ukraine. And they waited for the West to speak out against the neo-Nazis, which what actually happened is the West denied there were neo-Nazis despite numerous reports in the media of the power of neo-Nazis going back to the Maidan Square coup and the role of neo-Nazi forces such as the Azov Battalion in launching the fight against the pro-Russian forces in the Donbass. So what you have here is a clear picture of two different directions. One toward development, toward a monetary system which is aimed at improving the physical conditions of life for people, as opposed to the attempt to maintain control of a collapsing financial system, which maintains its control through censorship, through lies, through threats to kill those people who have the courage to speak the truth, and intends to commit itself to economic policies which will deprive people of energy and food. So take the time to watch our press conference yesterday. What we have to do is shut down this kill list and shift the policy of NATO away from this self-suicide. And one way you can help with that is to join us this weekend. The Schiller Institute has a 2-day online conference. You can register for it at theschillerinstitute.com. Tomorrow is Friday. I'll be taking your questions. Send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com.